Bullshit.
Pretend for a moment we've entered a parallel universe free of bullshit and full of bold solutions. That's what the No BS Marketing Show is all about. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich. Our guest today is Tricia Warrick. But first, let's cut the bullshit. Have you ever been in an organization that put a long-run function under a short-run function? What do I mean by long-run versus short-run functions? It's about the mindset or drive of a function within an organization. For example, sales is focused on the short run first, while marketing is focused on the long run first. This doesn't mean sales doesn't think about the long run or that marketing isn't concerned with the short run. What it means is that the mindset of those key areas are dramatically different. Sales has to think short term first, while marketing has to think long term first. I've led both functions a number of times throughout my career. I can tell you that when sales is leading marketing, you don't have much of a marketing function. You have a tactical group of people producing on-demand stuff that sales thinks they need to close more business. And I stress the word thinks they need. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they aren't, but you need research. This might work for a little while in the short term. And some companies are in industries where it might even be okay for a long time. But the reality is those companies aren't growth-oriented, because to be a growth-oriented company, you have to have a real marketing effort. You need to have a long-run view that's customer-focused. You need to build and create a marketing culture. You need to understand the trends, what's coming down the pike. You need to know who your target markets really are, not just who you think they are, who they really are, and all that's done through marketing. If you have a short-run function like sales in control of a long-run function like marketing, you're going to get passed up by a competitor who understands the market better and who can reach and influence that market with the right message through the right channel at the right time. Make the positive change happen as soon as you can. Create a marketing culture. Find real marketers to develop and implement your marketing plan. I say real marketers because if you have marketing under sales right now, the people that stuck around might not be real marketers, or at the very least, they might be tactical people who will need to change their mindset under your new, real marketing leader. To land that new, real marketing leader, you'll need to put marketing where it belongs, reporting directly to the chief executives. In other words, you'll have to cut the BS. Our guest today is Tricia Warrick. Tricia served as Chief Operating Officer, Strategic Consultant, M&A Advisor, and Banker to CEOs and shareholders of more than 500 mid-market companies. Earlier in her career, she led mid-market and business banking at Mellon. She now facilitates successful business and leadership transformations as a chair for Vistage Worldwide, the world's leading chief executive organization. Tricia, welcome to the show.
Dave, thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're excited. You and I got into so much during the pre-interview part before hitting play and record, I should say, that Mike Gaddy said, you know, you guys have to hit play and record because you're talking too much. So I'm really excited. We've got a lot to cover. But let's start by having you walk us through your educational background and your career journey.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I probably would say that my educational background started outside of the classroom as far as what has happened on my career journey. I grew up in a family with 7 children in Forest Hills, east of Pittsburgh. And of those 7 kids, I had 5 brothers. And when I think about my career journey, and I think about the extraordinary success that I'm so fortunate to have had, it really is grounded in the education I got from those 5 brothers growing up in a house in Forest Hills, and the education that I got from my father, who was a very successful entrepreneur in Pittsburgh, who dropped out of Westinghouse High School and started a company which eventually became Chelsea Building Products in Oakmont, which is, my father was actually one of the first extruders of vinyl window profiles in the United States, as a feisty Italian who never could work for anyone else. So to answer your question, my education started very early on. Formally, I went to, I'm proud to say this actually, I went to what was Churchill High School, now Woodland Hills. So I started my educational process, as we all do in those formative years, and was fortunate enough to have my oldest brother, who's 10 years older than me, see my report card on the refrigerator, because I was pretty destined with an Italian father to become a wife and mother, which was a wonderful place for a lot of people to go. But my brother had a lot of feelings that that shouldn't happen. And it was my brother Jimmy who actually said, no, she needs to go to college. This is amazing. I had very good grades. So I went to Kenyon College, Gambier, Ohio, in the middle of cornfields. It was probably the 4 most formative educational years of my life. Very strong academics there. I didn't really appreciate as a 20-year-old what kind of potential I had until I had some phenomenal professors there. I majored in economics there, graduated from Kenyon, and shortly thereafter took a position at Kaufman's in their management training program back before Kaufman's department store was acquired. And 2 things happened at Kaufman's. I decided that I definitely didn't want to be in retail merchandising because generally speaking, you needed to have a passion for fashion, which many of my friends and relatives would tell you I don't exactly. I'm not part of the fashion elite. And secondly, I met my husband. So 2 great things happened in that first job. And we very shortly thereafter were married and moved to Maryland, where I took a position with Maryland National Bank. And Maryland National is now a part of Bank of America. I was there in Baltimore from the very, very late 70s until the mid 80s. I went through their management training program as a commercial lender. And I would tell anyone that it was really lending money to middle market companies was so invigorating, and I learned so much seeing all of those different companies over that period of time. And in the mid 80s, I actually, and part of that, by the way, on the educational side, I did take some classes. I talked my way into this job. I had no finance background. I was an economics major, but that was not finance, no accounting. And the boss took a flyer on me, Tim McMillan, and hired me and made me take classes at the University of Maryland in accounting. So I was taking classes there. So I got my accounting skills built up, and that put me on my way in my banking career. But came back to Pittsburgh in 84. I'm not going to talk about my career at this point, but at one point during my Mellon stay, I actually was part of an ex-MBA program at the University of Wisconsin. I did do all of the coursework for 2 years and was very good in finance and in banking, and did not finish my paper because I got pregnant and had a baby instead, which candidly I wouldn't trade that for the world. Would I like to have that MBA on my resume? Absolutely. I had all the coursework, but I wouldn't trade my wonderful son for anything. So that's my formal education.
Well, a couple of things that were pretty interesting. So you had the opportunity to really, early on in your career, go through 2 management training programs.
Yes.
With Kaufman's and the bank. Mm-hmm. That's unique, and in and of itself is pretty much like a management master's. Mm-hmm. What can you say about that? Because one of the things today, there's not as much training. One of the downsides of smaller companies and the gig economy with people working as freelancers and companies that are smaller taking much of a bigger stakehold. What do you think about that? Because you had a foundation from 2 management training programs. How do you think that impacts today if there aren't as many of those?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and particularly on the banking side, I have noted that because the Kaufman's training was about managing a balance sheet of inventory and controlling open to buy and controlling gross margins and obviously driving sales. So I got a very micro education at Kaufman's regarding driving the success of a business and managing salespeople who didn't all want to be at work, which was also quite an education for me early on in my early 20s. The education at Mellon was much more, or at Maryland National, was much more technical driven. And I know that for the banks today, with many of the commercial lenders on the verge of retiring, I think there's pretty much of a scrambling going on in the banking community where they're stealing each other's employees because there aren't any foundational training programs at most of the banks today to provide those students right out of school with basic underwriting skills and financial analysis skills and industry evaluation skills that are really critical to being an effective lender. So I believe that there is an issue out there right now that we're going to hear about more in the next 5 years.
You also had an interesting thing happen from someone who I'm going to assume played some of a mentoring role, because I do want to get into your mentors. You mentioned your brother and your dad, but beyond family. But before that question, that was pretty cool that you had someone at that era say to you, you're really good, but you don't have the accounting that you need. Go take these classes while you're here, and we're training you in these other ways. That particular leader made an impact on you. Hugely.
He took a bet on me. And I think he realized that I had, in banking and commercial lending, there's two basic sets of skills that you need to have that really are right and left brain. One of them really is the more analytical side, the being able to tear through numbers and understand them and really glean insights from seeing numbers on paper. The other one, to be a commercial lender, and Dave, seen this, is sales skills, being able to interact effectively with people, being able to serve a middle market client, build trust with them, gain their respect. And he saw those two things from my background, but I didn't have that exact technical skill. Uh-huh. So yes, he did take a gamble on me, and I succeeded, which was cool.
What was his name?
Tim McMillan.
Okay. And you worked for him for a couple of years. Did you were able to stay in touch with him for a few years after that?
I did actually. Yeah.
And who would be another mentor you might bring up throughout your career?
Well, it's interesting. My banking career is where the mentors are. And the other mentor that comes to mind for me is Jeff Leininger. Jeff was the head of middle market lending at Mellon when I moved to Mellon in 1984 as a lending officer, and one of the only female lenders in all of Mellon at that time. And there weren't a whole lot of us. And Jeff, and I was ambitious, and I worked very hard, and I had great relationships. And Dave, if you looked at my client list in 1984, you would not believe the companies I had as clients. I had some of the most magnificent clients in Pittsburgh, just phenomenal middle market companies. And Jeff, so I got there figuring I'd be a lender for 5 years and not really saying I want to be in management, you need to promote me. And within 18 months of me arriving at Mellon, I became a team leader and actually had, a dozen or so lending officers reporting to me. And I started in mid-84. By mid-86, I was running middle market lending. So the Pittsburgh region, the tri-state region, Jeff had, and I was running the whole Pittsburgh region, which was really the crown jewels. At the time, you're a marketing guy, you'll appreciate this. Mellon had 40-some% primary market share among middle market companies in Western Pennsylvania. I mean, one in every two middle market companies followed in the legacy of Andrew Mellon and were banking with Mellon Bank. Just unbelievable. And I was running that whole area with 70-some lenders at the age of 33, maybe 32. So Jeff was my other mentor. He believed in me just as Tim had. Uh-huh. He saw things that I didn't see in myself and handed me the keys long before I would have taken the keys to lead and run that area, which was quite an honor.
Well, you had that opportunity to be a little bit at Kaufman's. You had the ability to jump into another industry. You had a mentor that helped you to get caught up school-wise till you had the technical aspect, and you have a second mentor in banking. So now you're going through all that. But during that time, and even go beyond that time, it's an OBS marketing show, and so we have to put everybody on the spot in two ways. And one is more just saying when they've seen BS in the marketplace, it doesn't have to be about them. It could just be a company or a culture. And then I'll follow that up with putting you on the spot and say, when was there a time where you maybe weren't the leader that you wanted to be or the employee you wanted to be, and what did you learn from it? So let's take the first one. When did you notice some BS when you were with any company in your career? What was it, and what ended up becoming of it?
My next move after middle market lending, Mellon had its fall from grace in the late 80s. Had some bad loans in various places, and for the first time in its history got into trouble. Many of my colleagues were being let go. The bank was going through a major restructuring under the shadow of Warburg Pincus, who had bought a significant interest in Mellon. For the very first time, Mellon had a strong partner on the equity side who was going to make significant changes in the organization. And crazy as it was, during that time, I was promoted and moved over into the retail bank which is really where I got put my marketing hat on more, to run business banking. And when you ask me about bullshit, BS, we would call it, most banks in the United States had not focused on the small business market. It was an incidental thing that happened because banks had branch systems and collected deposits and made small loans to small businesses. And at the time, Mellon threw every company between startup all the way through 10 million in revenue into its business banking world. And a lot of that business was being serviced out of the branch system. And the marketing assumption was grounded in the fact that all of those companies were alike. And interestingly, that played out in a few ways when I took this position. At first, I was sort of shooting from the hip. Then the obvious thing that I felt that I needed to do was to upgrade the leadership team, which we did do, which was important to do. To put I called it my board of directors, 8 regional directors of business banking reporting to me in 3 or 4 states, and needed to get the right people in those positions. But after that, it became very clear to me very quickly that we didn't understand our customer. Our customer was not one customer. When you look at that $0 to $10 million business market, there are sales segments that are completely different. There are maturity segments from startups all the way through to declining businesses. Industries that are completely different in the way that they operate, different types of owners, from franchisees to franchisors to privately held companies, and their needs were all different. So one of the first things that we did, and by the way, I didn't mention we were losing money. So one of the reasons I was put into this job was to turn it around, was probably the main reason. So at my ripe young age of 35, I was handed this opportunity. And what we did was 2 things, which I advocate very strongly. One of those is to sort of sift through the marketing misunderstandings and the customer misunderstandings that we had in terms of how we went to market, how we sold, and how we marketed, and how we underwrote loans. We did exhaustive market research to better understand those market segments and to do market segmentation that would allow us to drive strategy into micro markets that were completely different, absolutely completely different. The second thing that we did was get help. And you talked early on about finding a marketing firm who actually has prowess in understanding marketing and what the difference is between sales and marketing. And we hired McKinsey. And McKinsey came in for a year and side saddled my leadership team in helping us to take that research information that we got, tons of it, that segmentation data, combine it with our financial data, having a deep understanding as to what the drivers were of profitability in each of those segments of the business. So you straddle the market information with the financial information and begin to understand how to drive growth and how to drive profitability in that business. And as a result of that, we had 3 or 4 key strategies that we openly communicated to all of our lenders. We had 250 lenders, 300 lenders in 3 states. They all understood our strategies very, very well. We drove that strategy down into the organization. And one of the big outcomes that happened was that the way that we sold and marketed changed for the low end of the market. When you think about mid-sized companies, which a lot of the bigger companies in the business banking world behaved more like middle market companies. They had multiple layers of management in place. They had a CFO. They were a little bit more sophisticated. The smaller companies weren't. The owner wore a ton of hats and basically worked morning, noon, and night. And we actually couldn't reach the market at the time was 250 million companies. That's how many companies were in our market. And we realized that we couldn't go out and high touch call on all of those companies. It just wouldn't work. And it was the first time in my career that I learned about direct mail and telemarketing, which today is really social media and the follow-up that you do with social media. But back then was direct mail, telemarketing, and our branches actually led the charge on that. We actually put the branches out there to reach out to that small business market. Complete change from what had been done in the past.
That's Tricia Warrick on the No BS Marketing Show. More in a minute. Want to talk to you about Audible, Are you using Audible yet? If not, you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/nobs. And I stumbled across a book that I started liking it so much on Kindle that I actually got it on both Audible and Kindle. And it's I had heard an interview on Sirius, and it was with someone who was involved with this book. And it's a book called Running with the Devil, A Backstage Pass to the Wild Times, Loud Rock, and the Down and Dirty Truth Behind the Making of Van Halen by Noel Monk and Joel Layden. You can download it for free today. Go to audibletrial.com/nobs. If you're someone that enjoyed music from the 80s and into the 90s, it's a really great read or listen on Audible or your Kindle. One quick story is their first album comes out from Van Halen. And when the album came out, nobody really knew who they were outside of their own market. But as they began touring, they were placed on a tour as the first of 3 acts, with the second act being Ronnie Montrose, who actually was a band that had Sammy Hagar in that band, but Sammy Hagar left, and ironically, Sammy Hagar ends up replacing David Lee Roth. But we're going down this whole Van Halen thing. So there was Van Halen opening, Ronnie Montrose, who at the time was decent, and Journey, who at the time was up and coming, was the headliner. So if you think about those two being on the same bill, Van Halen and Journey, those are 2 pretty big powerhouses a few years later. As the tour begins, again, the headliner, the main one, is Journey. Van Halen would rock the crowd, and the middle act was screwed because Van Halen would just do such a tremendous job that people would pretty much boo the middle guy. And during the whole middle act, Van Halen would be partying like crazy. So Steve Perry of Journey, if anybody is a Journey fan or knows anything about Steve Perry, and most people do because of Don't Stop Believin', making a rebirth the last 15 years, Steve Perry's pretty calm, quiet, laid back, great voice and so forth, but definitely not anything like David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen. So he is walking past the party that's going on when he's about to go on stage, and he had bought this new leather jacket that day. And remember, both these bands are still just starting out, and Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth are yucking it up and start a food fight, and Eddie throws a pile of guacamole, goes past David Lee Roth, lands in Stephen Perry's hair and on his brand new leather jacket. So suffice it to say, when you're this act that nobody even knew at the time, and now you're becoming big and you just got the headliner really ticked off, they tried to get Van Halen fired, and Van Halen's manager, who wrote the book, said, I called the record company and said, really? Really? You're going to try and pull us off this tour when we're the one drawing the people? And sure enough, they didn't get pulled off the tour. So that's from the book, Running with the Devil, Backstage Pass to the Wild Times, Loud Rock, and the Down and Dirty Truth Behind the Making of Van Halen. Get your free version today at audibletrial.com/nobs. You can get that one and over 180,000 other titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. We're with Tricia Warrick of Vistage International and many other positions before that. She's going to tell us about all those. She's about a third of the way through the career, I think. But now we're going to put you on the spot. Talk about a learning experience when maybe you, Tricia, were the BS employee, a tough boss, or your communication was not what it needed to be. Looking back, when do you think you might have been guilty of some BS? What did you do about it, and what did you learn that could help our listeners?
Very interesting question, Dave. I had a boss at Mellon. His name was Dick Guy. He was a vice chairman. And one of the lines that he had for me, where he threw me out of his office periodically, I was running business banking at the time, was that I was not encumbered with the facts. He told me this over and over again because I had this really bad habit. I was very instinctive a lot of the time. So I had this really bad habit of wanting to just get to the decision and move on. And at times I really didn't have all the information that I needed to make that important decision. And one of those decisions had to do with how we actually, going back to my direct mail and telemarketing example, how we actually marketed to the other segment of that small business market, which was everybody else. It was the bigger small business companies. These are smaller manufacturers in Pittsburgh. They are smaller retail shops and whatever, but clearly established companies who've been around for perhaps generations and done quite well. And I was off on a tangent on the marketing and sales side. And again, I love your long-term marketing, more short-term sales example. It really plays well into this. I sort of dismissed understanding the customer here. I threw it out the window. I realized that our market share in that segment of the market was actually pretty good, and that we had a really decent reputation in that part of the business, and I sort of leapt over understanding the customer and started to give my lenders sales goals, calling goals, and skipped over developing any kind of a longer term marketing plan, really developing any sales plan, and just basically said, I can't remember what the number was, call it 50 calls a month. So you're going to take care of your customers, and I want you to make these 50 calls a month. And they really did not have the tools that they needed to identify. Forget the internet. There was no internet back then. We had no information on these companies at all. They were all private. And all we had were these Dun & Bradstreet lists. And Dun & Bradstreet, as you know, is not exactly the greatest source of information for companies. And sort of sent my lenders out to do this without having really thought through scripting them, giving them the tools that they needed in the way. And so we actually, at the end of the day, we backpedaled because we realized that just setting an arbitrary calling goal wasn't going to get us where we needed to go. What was going to get us where we needed to go was going back to that research and back to that segmentation analysis and better understanding, how do these companies make decisions? What are their 3 key needs, which they had 3. And the eventuality after 6 months of probably torment on the part of all these lending officers was that we went back and said, okay, here are the 3 things that they need: advice and counsel, we had to be willing to lend, and we needed to actually still have a branch nearby, which back then, again, you didn't have all of the electronic means to deposit and things like that. So those were the 3 things, and educated our lenders. So on the sales side, they were better equipped to go out and sell because they had a better understanding of who this customer was and how they made decisions and how they selected a bank. And we built a major marketing program that was longer term, that built Mellon's presence and reputation in that market on the branding side through business-to-business advertising at that low level, pretty much focused on PR and testimonials from customers and that, because businesses don't always just believe advertising. They have more of a tendency to believe it when someone says that someone makes a recommendation. And that worked much better than just cold calling.
I kind of like the phrase that your boss used when you would come in sometimes with purely instinctual, and he'd hit you with your unencumbered with the facts. But did he do it in a nice delivery that was helpful and taught you, or was he being like biting humor?
Oh, he's biting humor. I mean, anyone who knew Dick Goff, great guy, and worked with him knows that he had biting humor. And we all got used to that biting humor. And he was a strong leader. He sent you out the door he sent you packing with something to do. Unencumbered
by the facts. So at what point did you realize, was it 3-4 months after you had set them out with the goal of, again, you pulled an arbitrary number of 50 and it might have been whatever. But so now you've increased their sales call load and how much you're expecting them to do on a volume side of touches on the sales side. What point did you realize, and was it a lot of feedback from the team? Were they coming back saying, Tricia, this is just insane. I can't get my other clients done. Or what led you to make the shift? Because you were nimble and made a shift and turned it around rather quickly. What were some of the signals?
We weren't getting in the door. I mean, this is a very important lesson. Cold calling for most companies doesn't really work. You have to have a relationship. They need to have some brand awareness of you. They have to have a reason that they want to meet with you. There needs to be some malcontent, some malcontent of some sort. And so the lenders we were pretty open. It wasn't a situation where the lenders were afraid to say something. And that information began to percolate up that they weren't even getting to the decision maker in these companies quickly. And that we needed to give them the tools and we needed to give them the marketing support behind those tools in order to get them in the door.
I love how you also came back and pretty much had the 3 prongs of what your messaging had to be built around. And you said how you need to be able to be willing to lend to them, and the 2 other ones. I like how you came back with that, because now you've streamlined what you want to accomplish and what you want to convey to them, and you based that on what you heard from them and what you analyzed about them. So it was really a kind of a hit the bullseye strategy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it did work.
Hear more of my interview with Tricia Warrick on part 2